The sun filtered through the tall oaks in the backyard of Ethan and Madison Cooper's home. It was the perfect day for a family barbecue: blue skies, warm laughter, and the comforting scent of grilled burgers wafting through the air. Ethan, 35, had always prided himself on keeping his family close, especially after his mother passed away 3 years ago. His father, Robert, had been a rock for the family ever since, stepping in to help Ethan and Madison with their 2 young children, Olivia and Noah. "Ethan, do you mind grabbing some ice for the drinks?" Madison's voice floated through the kitchen window, her tone warm and cheerful. She looked radiant today, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she arranged a tray of drinks on the patio table. Ethan smiled, grateful for her seemingly boundless energy and ability to keep everything running smoothly. As Ethan left to retrieve the ice, he glanced back at the gathering: his father chatting with neighbors, Madison laughing with Ethan's sister, Carly, and the kids chasing each other with water balloons. This was his life, a picture-perfect family scene he'd worked so hard to build. But later that afternoon, the picture began to crack. Ethan returned to find Madison and Robert standing close together near the garden shed. They seemed deep in conversation, their heads bent toward each other. From a distance, it looked innocent enough, but something about their body language stopped Ethan in his tracks. Madison reached out and placed her hand lightly on Robert's arm, a gesture Ethan had seen her make countless times when comforting him. Only this time, it wasn't directed at him. He told himself he was overthinking it. Madison and Robert had always been close. After all, Madison had taken it upon herself to check in on Robert regularly since Ethan's mom passed, often bringing over meals or inviting him to dinner. Ethan shook off the uneasy feeling and carried the ice inside, but the image lingered in his mind. As the party continued, small details began to stand out. Madison seemed unusually attentive to Robert, refilling his drink before he asked and laughing a little too hard at his jokes. At one point, Ethan noticed Robert leaning in to whisper something to her, and Madison flushed a deep shade of pink. By evening, the guests had trickled out, leaving only Ethan, Madison, and Robert. Ethan insisted on cleaning up while Madison put the kids to bed. Robert offered to help, but Ethan waved him off, using the time to clear his head. When he finally joined Madison in their bedroom, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. "Tired?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. "Exhausted," she replied without looking up. Ethan hesitated. The day had been perfect, or so he thought. But now, an unfamiliar knot of doubt tightened in his chest. "You and my dad seem to be having a lot of fun today," he said casually, testing the waters. Madison's fingers froze on her phone, just for a moment, before she shrugged. "He's your dad, Ethan. I tried to keep him included. He gets lonely." Her response was reasonable, but the slight edge to her voice unsettled him. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered, letting it drop for now. As the house grew quiet and Madison drifted off to sleep, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the hand on Robert's arm or the whispered words. It was the way Madison had deflected his question so easily, as though she had practiced the answer. The next morning, Ethan resolved to shake off his paranoia. After all, he had no real reason to doubt either Madison or his father. But as the days went on, Ethan began to notice other small, unsettling moments: missed calls from Madison when she was running errands, or Robert stopping by unannounced to drop off something trivial. One evening, when Madison was out, Ethan received a text from Carly. "Hey, did Dad say anything to you about leaving early last week? He told me he had to meet someone, but he seemed really secretive." Ethan frowned at the message. Last week, Robert had left the barbecue early, saying he needed to get some rest. What could have been so urgent? Ethan responded. "No, but I'll ask him." Probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and Ethan's gut told him so. Whatever had begun between Madison and his father wasn't innocent, and he was about to find out just how deep the betrayal ran. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Carly's text about their father leaving the barbecue early, combined with Madison's unusually defensive response about their interactions, gnawed at the back of his mind. He had always trusted both his wife and his father implicitly, but now, doubt clung to him like a shadow. The following day, while Madison was out shopping and the kids were at school, Ethan decided to pay Robert a visit. His father lived in a modest single-story home a few miles away, a house that felt unnaturally quiet since Ethan's mother passed. The drive over felt longer than usual, his thoughts bouncing between frustration and guilt. What am I even looking for? Ethan asked himself. Maybe Carly's just overthinking things, and I am too. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. When he arrived, Robert was sitting on the front porch, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up with a smile as Ethan approached, the kind of warm, fatherly grin Ethan had always admired. "Hey, son. What brings you by?" Robert asked, folding the paper and setting it aside. "Just thought I'd stop in," Ethan said casually, sitting down on the porch steps. "Madison's running errands, and I had some free time." Robert nodded and took another sip of his coffee. "How's she doing? She seemed a little tired the other day." Ethan paused, watching his father closely. The comment seemed innocent, but there was something about the way Robert said it, too careful, too measured. "Yeah, she's been busy lately. Taking care of the kids, helping out at the school, you know how she is." Robert smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's a good woman. You're lucky to have her." Ethan's stomach twisted at the words. He didn't know why, but they sounded wrong, like there was a hidden meaning beneath them. "I know I am," Ethan said, forcing a smile. He leaned back against the porch railing, trying to keep his tone light. "Carly mentioned you left the barbecue early last week. Something come up?" Robert hesitated, just for a moment, before shrugging. "Nothing important. Just wasn't feeling great, that's all." Ethan studied his father's face, searching for cracks in the mask of calm. "You sure? She said you seemed in a hurry?" Robert waved a hand dismissively. "Carly worries too much. I just wanted to get home and rest." Ethan nodded, but the explanation felt thin. His father was usually an open book, but today, there was a guardedness in his demeanor that Ethan couldn't ignore. As the conversation shifted to safer topics, work, the kids, the upcoming holidays, Ethan's mind remained elsewhere, replaying the moments at the barbecue, Carly's text, and now, Robert's vague responses. Something was off, and Ethan was determined to figure out what it was. Later that evening, as Ethan helped Madison clean up after dinner, he decided to bring up his visit to Robert. "Stopped by to see Dad today," he said casually, handing her a plate to dry. "Oh?" Madison glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the dishes. "How's he doing?" "Fine," Ethan said, watching her closely. "He asked about you. Said you seemed tired?" Madison froze for a fraction of a second before continuing to dry the plate. "That's sweet of him," she said, her tone neutral. Ethan leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "He also mentioned leaving the barbecue early last week. Said he wasn't feeling well." Madison didn't look up, but her grip on the plate tightened. "Yeah, I remember. He said something about needing to rest." Her response was too quick, too rehearsed. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he studied her face. "Funny thing is, Carly thought it was strange. She said he seemed secretive." Madison set the plate down a little too hard, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "Are you and Carly swapping conspiracy theories now?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Madison said, turning to face him, "you're reading too much into nothing. Your dad wasn't feeling well, and now you're making it into some kind of mystery." Ethan stared at her, his frustration growing. "Why are you getting so defensive?" "I'm not defensive," she snapped, but the flush creeping up her neck said otherwise. The tension in the room was palpable, and Ethan knew he wouldn't get any answers tonight. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. Forget I said anything." But as Madison turned back to the dishes, Ethan noticed her hands were trembling. The next day, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. If there was something going on, he needed proof. That afternoon, while Madison was out picking up the kids, Ethan went into her home office and opened her laptop. He felt a pang of guilt as he entered her password, something she'd shared with him years ago and never thought to change, but his curiosity outweighed his conscience. At first, everything seemed normal: emails from the school, online shopping receipts, reminders for upcoming appointments. But as Ethan scrolled through her messages, he noticed one email thread that stood out. The subject line was innocuous enough. Sunday plans? It was from Robert. Ethan's heart pounded as he opened the email. Robert. Looking forward to seeing you Sunday. Same time as usual? Madison. Of course. I'll bring what you like. Robert. Perfect. Can't wait. The messages were vague, but the familiarity in the tone was unmistakable. Ethan stared at the screen, his mind racing. What plans? What was she bringing? And why hadn't either of them mentioned it to him? Before he could dig deeper, he heard the sound of the front door opening. Panic surged through him as he quickly closed the laptop and stepped out of the office, forcing a smile as Madison walked in with the kids. Hey, babe, she said, setting the grocery bags on the counter. How was your day? Ethan's chest felt tight as he replied. Good. Just busy. But inside, his mind was anything but calm. Sunday was only 2 days away, and Ethan was determined to find out exactly what Madison and Robert were hiding. Ethan could barely sleep in the 2 nights leading up to Sunday. The email exchange between Madison and Robert haunted him, the words circling in his mind like vultures over a dying sense of trust. Same time as usual. What did that even mean? How long had usual been going on? By the time Sunday morning rolled around, Ethan's suspicions had hardened into a determination to uncover the truth. Madison was bustling around the house as usual, cheerful and efficient as she got the kids ready for church. Ethan noticed she seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off her. Or maybe she was simply excited for her secret meeting. Are you coming with us today? She asked, looking up from tying Noah's shoes. Ethan shook his head. Nah, I've got some things to take care of around the house. Madison didn't push, just nodded and kissed him on the cheek before loading the kids into the car. As he watched them drive off, Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He'd never been the jealous or suspicious type, and now here he was, sneaking around like a spy in his own home. But the guilt was quickly drowned out by resolve. He needed answers. An hour later, Madison returned home, her energy vibrant as she carried in a tote bag. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to scroll through his phone. What's that? He asked, nodding toward the bag. Just a few things I needed for later, Madison said breezily, setting it on the counter. For later? Ethan pressed, keeping his tone casual. Yeah, I told you. I'm meeting up with Carly to go over some stuff for the kids' school fundraiser. Madison replied without missing a beat. She grabbed the bag and started toward the bedroom. Ethan clenched his jaw. Carly was out of town visiting her in-laws for the weekend, something Madison must have forgotten he knew. But instead of calling her out, he let it slide, deciding to stick to his plan. By the time Madison left the house that afternoon, dressed a little nicer than usual in a flowy blue dress Ethan didn't recognize, he was ready. She kissed him goodbye and said she'd be back by dinner time. Have fun, Ethan said, watching her closely. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her smile tightening ever so slightly. I will. The door closed, and Ethan sprang into action. He followed her. It felt absurd at first, sitting in his car a few blocks behind hers, but the adrenaline rushing through his veins drowned out any hesitation. Madison's route was familiar at first. She passed the park, the grocery store, and the library, but when she turned onto a narrow side street, Ethan's heart began to race. She wasn't heading to Carly's house, that much was clear. Instead, she pulled into the driveway of a small, secluded house on the outskirts of town. Ethan parked a safe distance away, watching as she stepped out of the car with the tote bag and made her way to the door. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the door opened, and Robert stepped outside. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched his wife embrace his father. It wasn't a simple hug either. It was intimate, too intimate. Robert's hand lingered on her back, and Madison tilted her face up toward him, her expression warm and unguarded. Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. The door closed behind them, leaving Ethan alone in the silence of his car. His mind reeled, cycling through disbelief, rage, and heartbreak. How could they do this to him? How long had it been going on? And why would his own father betray him like this? For a moment, he considered storming up to the house and confronting them right then and there. But something stopped him. No, he thought. Not yet. Instead, Ethan pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos of the house, the cars in the driveway, and the time. Evidence. He needed more than just accusations if he wanted to confront them properly. By the time Madison returned home that evening, Ethan had calmed himself enough to play along. She came through the door with her usual bright smile, carrying the now empty tote bag. "Hey, everything go okay?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah, it was great," Madison replied, setting the bag down. "We got a lot done for the fundraiser." Ethan fought the urge to demand answers right then and there. Instead, he nodded and kissed her on the forehead. "That's good. Glad it went well." But as Madison went about her evening as though nothing had happened, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of her lies pressing down on him. She was good, too good at pretending everything was normal. Ethan knew he couldn't confront her until he had all the pieces of the puzzle. Whatever was going on between her and Robert, it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment mistake. It was calculated, deliberate, and it wasn't going to end unless he made it end. The next day, Ethan took a bold step. He installed a small tracking app on Madison's phone, something he never dreamed of doing before. It felt wrong, invasive even, but he couldn't shake the image of her in Robert's arms. He also decided to pay Carly a visit when she returned from her trip. She'd always been good at noticing things, and Ethan hoped she might be able to help him piece together the truth. But even as he made his plans, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. No matter what he uncovered, the damage had already been done. The question now wasn't whether Madison and Robert were guilty. It was how far Ethan was willing to go to make them pay for their betrayal. Ethan felt like a man walking a tightrope. Each passing day added more weight to the burden he carried, his suspicion, his growing certainty of Madison and Robert's betrayal, and the suffocating tension of keeping it all bottled up. He couldn't let on that he knew. Not yet. The tracking app he'd installed on Madison's phone gave him the first solid lead. For the next few days, Ethan carefully monitored her movements. Most of the time, her routine seemed perfectly normal, dropping the kids off at school, running errands, attending PTA meetings. But one particular afternoon, she made a detour. Ethan watched the screen of his laptop as the tracking app showed Madison's location moving toward the outskirts of town, the same secluded house she had visited on Sunday. He clenched his fists, his anger simmering. "She's bold," he muttered to himself, staring at the blinking dot that represented her. Too bold. Determined to uncover more, Ethan decided to take another step. He called his sister Carly, who had just returned from her weekend trip. "Hey, Carly. Got a minute?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Sure," she said. "What's up?" Ethan hesitated. Carly was sharp, and if he wasn't careful, she'd see right through him. "It's about Dad," he began. "Have you noticed anything unusual about him lately?" Carly paused. "Unusual how?" "I don't know. Like, has he been acting secretive? Leaving suddenly? Just not himself?" Carly sighed. "I mean, yeah, kind of. I didn't want to say anything, but he's been weird ever since Mom passed. Like, I get it, grief is hard, but he's been different. Quieter. Sometimes I feel like he's hiding something, you know?" Ethan's stomach twisted. "Yeah, I've been getting the same vibe." "Why? Did something happen?" Carly asked, her tone suddenly more alert. "Not exactly," Ethan said carefully. "I'm just trying to figure out if there's anything going on." Maybe I'm overthinking it. Carly didn't sound convinced. Well, if you find out anything, let me know. You know how I feel about him bottling things up. If there's something wrong, we should help him. Ethan thanked her and ended the call, guilt gnawing at him. Carly was in the dark, and for now, he needed it to stay that way. The following Saturday, Ethan made his next move. He waited until Madison had left for one of her errands, then drove to Robert's house. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled into the driveway, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. When Robert opened the door, he looked surprised to see Ethan standing there. "Ethan," he said, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you by?" Ethan stepped into the living room, scanning the space for any sign of Madison. He didn't find her, but his eyes landed on something else, a wine glass sitting on the coffee table, next to a faint lipstick stain. "I needed to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice tighter than he intended. "About what?" Robert asked, sitting down and gesturing for Ethan to do the same. Ethan remained standing. "About Madison." Robert froze, his expression carefully neutral. "Madison? What about her?" Ethan folded his arms. "I've been noticing some things. You two seem close lately. Closer than usual." Robert's face remained calm, but Ethan could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "We've always been close," Robert said. "She's family, Ethan. She's been a huge help to me since your mom passed." "Has she?" Ethan asked, his tone sharpening. "Or is there something else going on?" Robert leaned back, a hint of irritation creeping into his expression. "What are you trying to say, Ethan?" "I'm saying," Ethan said, his voice low and firm, "that I've seen the way she looks at you. I've seen the way you talk to her, how you act around her. And I know you're lying about something." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. Then Robert stood up, his voice measured but strained. "You're out of line," he said. "Whatever you think is going on, you're wrong." "Am I?" Ethan shot back. "Because Madison lied to me about where she was last Sunday. And you know where I found her? At some little house on the edge of town. With you." Robert's face strained of color. "You've been following her?" "You're damn right I have," Ethan said, stepping closer. "And I'm going to keep following her until I get the truth. So tell me, how long has this been going on?" Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the confrontation was too much to bear. "Ethan," he began, but his voice faltered. Before he could say anything else, Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from the tracking app. Madison's location had moved, and she was heading toward Robert's house. Ethan looked up, his blood running cold. "She's on her way here, isn't she?" Robert didn't respond, his silence confirming Ethan's suspicion. Ethan turned toward the door, his pulse pounding. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "Not by a long shot." As he stormed out of the house, his mind raced with possibilities. Whatever Madison and Robert were hiding, it was bigger than he'd imagined. And he was going to expose it, no matter what it cost. Ethan sat in his car outside the small, secluded house for the second time in a week. The property seemed even more eerie now that he knew its history. A dead man's house. Why here? Why risk meeting in such a conspicuous place if there wasn't something important about it? He clenched the steering wheel, his heart hammering. Today, he wasn't just watching. Today, he was going inside. Ethan had waited for the perfect moment, when Madison was busy with the kids and Robert was out fishing with friends. The house would be empty. As far as he knew, no one else had a reason to be there. He stepped out of his car and approached the door, his nerves on edge. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the house itself looked tired, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. It was the kind of place no one would notice, or care about. The front door was locked, but Ethan came prepared. With a small screwdriver he'd grabbed from his garage, he fumbled with the latch. It took a few tries, but eventually the lock clicked open. He slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. The house was sparsely furnished, with just a few old chairs, a sofa that had seen better days, and a coffee table stacked with magazines that looked decades old. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, searching for clues. On the coffee table, he noticed a single envelope, the edges worn as if it had been handled repeatedly. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and slid out the contents, several folded pieces of paper. As he unfolded them, his stomach turned. They were old letters, written in a looping, feminine handwriting. He skimmed through the first one. Robert, I don't know how much longer I can keep this a secret. The guilt is eating me alive, but I know we agreed this is for the best. If the truth ever came out, it would destroy everything. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read on. The letters were addressed to his father, written by someone named Lila. They spoke of a hidden relationship, of lies and promises, and of something too dangerous to reveal. But who was Lila? The name didn't ring a bell, and Ethan had no memory of anyone by that name in their family's orbit. Setting the letters aside, he moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was bare, the counters covered in a fine layer of dust. A single wine glass sat in the sink, recently used. The bedroom was no different, empty, save for a mattress on the floor and an old dresser. Ethan opened the dresser drawers, finding little of interest until he reached the bottom one. Inside was a small, locked box. His pulse quickened as he pulled it out and examined it. The lock was sturdy, and without a key, there was no way to open it now. Frustrated but unwilling to leave empty-handed, Ethan took a picture of the box and returned it to the drawer. He needed time to figure out what it might contain, and how to open it. As he made his way back to the living room, a sudden sound froze him in his tracks. The unmistakable crunch of gravel under tires. Someone was pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through Ethan as he ducked into the hallway, peering out the window. Madison's car rolled to a stop, her figure stepping out with practiced ease. She wasn't alone. Robert climbed out of the passenger seat, his expression unreadable as he followed Madison to the front door. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized his escape route was about to be cut off. Think fast. He spotted a closet at the end of the hallway and darted inside, shutting the door as quietly as he could. Through the slats, he could just make out the living room. The front door opened, and Madison and Robert entered. "I can't believe you forgot the letters," Madison said, her tone exasperated. "If Ethan ever saw those." "I told you, I'll take care of it," Robert replied, his voice low but firm. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were talking about the letters on the coffee table, the ones he had just been reading. Madison sighed, running a hand through her hair. "This is getting harder, Robert. He's suspicious. I can feel it." "You're imagining things," Robert said. "Ethan trusts you. He has no reason not to." Madison's laugh was bitter. "You didn't see the way he looked at me last night. He knows something's off." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. They were lying to his face, every day, and yet they had the audacity to talk about him like he was clueless. "We just have to stick to the plan," Robert said, his tone soothing. "It's almost over." "Almost over?" Madison snapped. "You've been saying that for months. How long do you think we can keep this up before he figures it out?" Robert stepped closer to her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Madison's expression softened, and Ethan felt a surge of anger as she leaned into Robert's touch. They stood there for a moment, their closeness driving the knife deeper into Ethan's chest. Finally, Madison pulled away. "I'll get the letters. You check the bedroom and make sure we didn't leave anything else." As they split up, Ethan's heart pounded. He needed to get out of the house before they found him, but he couldn't risk making a sound. Madison moved to the coffee table, scooping up the letters and slipping them into her bag. Meanwhile, Robert headed toward the bedroom, disappearing down the hallway. Ethan waited until Madison's back was turned, then carefully slipped out of the closet. His every step was silent, deliberate, as he crept toward the front door. He was almost there when he heard Robert's voice from the hallway. "Did you lock the box?" Madison froze, turning back toward the hallway. "I thought you had the key." Ethan didn't wait to hear more. He slipped out the door and into the cool evening air, his heart pounding as he made his way back to his car. As he drove away, his mind raced. The letters, the box, the house, all of it pointed to a secret that ran deeper than an affair. And whatever it was, Ethan was determined to uncover it. But he also knew one thing for certain: Madison and Robert were in way over their heads. And when the truth came out, it would destroy them. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind churned over every word he had overheard, every cryptic clue that pointed towards something larger and more devastating than a simple affair. Madison and Robert were hiding something they believed would ruin them if he found out. But now, Ethan had two critical pieces of leverage: the letters he had read and the photo of the locked box. Whatever was inside that box, it was important enough to make them both nervous. The next morning, Ethan went into detective mode. He sat at his desk with his laptop, poring over everything he could find about Daniel Carr, the house, and Robert's past. Most of the information was unremarkable. Daniel had been a quiet man with no family to speak of, and the house had remained empty since his passing. But as Ethan dug deeper, one article caught his attention. It was an old piece from the local newspaper, dated nearly 6 years ago. The headline read, "Mysterious Fire at Construction Site Claims Life of Local Worker." Ethan's stomach twisted as he read on. The article described a fire that had broken out at a construction site where Robert and Daniel had both been working. Daniel had been the only casualty, his body found near the source of the fire. The investigation ruled the incident an accident, citing faulty wiring as the cause. But something about the details didn't sit right with Ethan. According to the article, the fire had started after hours, and Daniel had no reason to be at the site so late. The report also mentioned that Robert had been the last person to see him alive. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Was it possible the fire wasn't an accident? Could it have something to do with the letters and the house? That afternoon, Ethan decided to confront the mystery head-on. He drove to the house on the outskirts of town, this time prepared to dig deeper. With a crowbar tucked under his arm, he returned to the bedroom where he had found the locked box. His hands shook as he pried it open, the sound of splintering wood echoing in the empty house. Inside the box were a stack of documents, a few faded photographs, and a small key. Ethan's breath caught as he sifted through the papers. The first document was a bank statement for an account he didn't recognize. The name on the account wasn't Robert's or Madison's, it was Lila Carr. Ethan's mind raced as he connected the dots. Lila Carr must have been Daniel's wife, and the letters he had read were hers. The next document was even more damning, a deed to the house, signed over to Robert a year before Daniel's death. Ethan's hands trembled as he picked up one of the photographs. It was a candid shot of Robert and Lila, standing close together, their smiles warm and intimate. They looked like a couple. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Robert and Lila had been having an affair. But what had gone so horribly wrong that they were still keeping it a secret after all these years? Ethan's attention shifted to the key. It was small and unremarkable, but it had to mean something. His mind raced as he tried to think of where it might fit. Back at home, Ethan's suspicions about Madison grew stronger. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, she seemed unusually tense, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone light. "Yeah," Madison said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." Ethan nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But as the evening wore on, his frustration grew. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Later that night, while Madison was in the shower, Ethan decided to search her belongings. He hated himself for the invasion of privacy, but he was desperate for answers. He started with her purse, his hands shaking as he rummaged through it. At first, he found nothing unusual: keys, wallet, a few receipts. But then he noticed a slip of paper folded into a small pocket. Unfolding it, he found an address scribbled in Madison's handwriting. It wasn't the address of the secluded house, it was somewhere else entirely. Ethan pulled out his phone and searched the address. It led to a storage facility on the other side of town. His pulse quickened. Was this where the key fit? The next morning, Ethan made an excuse to leave the house early, telling Madison he needed to run errands. As he drove to the storage facility, his mind raced with possibilities. When he arrived, the place was quiet, rows of metal doors stretching into the distance. He approached the office, his heart pounding as he asked the clerk if they could help him locate the unit tied to the address. "I'm actually checking on it for my wife," Ethan said, forcing a friendly smile. "She forgot to mention which unit it is." The clerk nodded and pulled up the information. "That's Unit 27, they said." "Thanks," Ethan said, pocketing the key as he headed to the unit. When he reached the door, his hands trembled as he inserted the key. The lock clicked open, and Ethan hesitated for a moment before lifting the door. Inside, he found boxes stacked neatly along the walls. He opened the nearest one, his stomach churning as he pulled out its contents. Photographs, journals, and documents spilled out, each one more damning than the last. There were pictures of Robert and Lila together, love letters exchanged between them, and even a copy of Daniel Carr's death certificate. Ethan's eyes widened as he read a journal entry in Lila's handwriting. "Robert and I made a terrible mistake. We never meant for it to happen, but we couldn't stop ourselves. And now, Daniel is dead. We didn't mean for him to find out. But he did, and everything spiraled out of control." Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an affair, it was a cover-up for something much worse. Ethan sat back on his heels, his mind spinning. Robert and Lila had been having an affair. Daniel had found out. And now Ethan was staring at the evidence of a conspiracy that had destroyed lives. But one question still burned in his mind: what did Madison have to do with all of this? He grabbed as much of the evidence as he could carry, determined to confront both Madison and Robert. The time for subtlety was over. Whatever their plan had been, whatever lies they had told to keep this buried, Ethan was about to tear it all apart. Ethan sat in his car in the driveway, staring blankly at the dashboard. The box of evidence from the storage unit sat in the passenger seat, its contents rattling in his mind like shards of broken glass. The affair between Robert and Lila, Daniel's death, the house, it was all connected. But what still gnawed at him was Madison. How deep was she in? Had she known about the affair? Was she part of the cover-up? He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had promised himself that he wouldn't act on impulse, but the rage boiling in his chest threatened to overtake him. Taking a deep breath, Ethan grabbed the box and stepped out of the car. The house was quiet when he entered, the faint sound of the kids' cartoons playing upstairs. Madison was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, humming softly to herself. She looked up as Ethan walked in, her smile as bright as ever. "You're home early," she said. "I thought you were out running errands." "I finished faster than I expected," Ethan replied, his voice calm but edged with tension. "Great," Madison said, turning back to her cutting board. "Dinner will be ready soon." Ethan placed the box on the counter with a deliberate thud, causing Madison to flinch. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Madison looked at the box, her face betraying a flicker of unease. "What's this?" "Something I found," Ethan said, crossing his arms. "At a storage unit. When you've been visiting." Her hands froze mid-chop. Slowly, she set the knife down and turned to face him, her expression carefully guarded. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me, Madison. I know about the house. I know about my dad and Lila Carr. And I know you've been helping him hide it." Madison's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as though she couldn't find the words. "Ethan. Save it," Ethan said, pulling out the journal entry and slapping it onto the counter. "Explain this." Explain why you've been sneaking around with my father, why you've been meeting him at that house, why you've been lying to me." Madison stared at the journal, her hands trembling as she reached for it. When she looked up at Ethan, her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Oh, really?" Ethan scoffed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been covering up an affair, and a murder." Madison's lips parted, but no sound came out. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, the weight of Ethan's accusation hanging in the air like a thundercloud. Finally, Madison spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about the affair, not at first." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not at first?" She took a shaky breath, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "When we got married, your dad told me about Lila. He said they'd been involved years ago, before Daniel died. He said it was a mistake, something he regretted." But what?" Ethan demanded. Madison hesitated, as though choosing her next words with extreme care. "A few months ago, he came to me. He was panicked, saying someone had found out about the affair, that they were threatening to expose everything. He begged me to help him." Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening. "And you agreed?" "I didn't know what else to do," Madison cried, her voice breaking. "He said it would destroy our family. He said he needed my help to keep it quiet." Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling with rage. "So you've been lying to me for months? Helping my father cover up his affair, and Daniel's death. Do you even hear yourself, Madison?" Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded. "I didn't want to lie to you, Ethan. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Ethan's voice was incredulous. "By sneaking around behind my back? By meeting him at that house? What else aren't you telling me?" Madison's silence spoke volumes. Ethan leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me everything. Now." Madison sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her confession. "Your father, he told me that Daniel found out about the affair. That's why he was at the construction site the night of the fire. He and your dad had an argument and what?" Ethan pressed. Madison swallowed hard. "And Robert said the fire wasn't an accident. He said Daniel started it in a fit of rage, but I think he's lying. I think he started the fire to cover his tracks." Ethan's stomach churned. "And you've known this for months?" Madison nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know what to do, Ethan. I was scared. He's your father. I didn't want to believe he was capable of something like that, but—" Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. His father, the man he had looked up to his entire life, was a liar, and possibly a murderer. And Madison, the woman he had trusted implicitly, had been complicit in covering it up. He grabbed the box of evidence and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Madison called after him, her voice panicked. "To get answers," Ethan said, his voice cold. "From him." Ethan drove to Robert's house, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He didn't bother knocking when he arrived, shoving the door open and stepping inside. Robert was sitting in the living room, a beer in hand, his face betraying a flicker of surprise at Ethan's sudden entrance. "Ethan," Robert said, setting the beer down. "What's going on?" "You tell me," Ethan growled, throwing the box onto the coffee table. "How long were you planning to lie to me? How long were you going to hide what you did to Daniel?" Robert's face paled as he stared at the box, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me!" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I know about Lila. I know about the fire. And I know you've been dragging Madison into your mess." Robert stood, his expression hardening. "You don't understand, Ethan. Then make me understand," Ethan demanded. "Tell me the truth, for once in your life." Robert hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he let out a long, shuddering breath. "All right," he said. "You want the truth? Here it is." Robert sank back into his chair, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. He rubbed his face with his hands, as if trying to muster the courage to speak. Ethan stood frozen, his fists clenched, waiting for the confession that would confirm his worst fears. "You have to believe me when I say I never meant for any of this to happen," Robert began, his voice hollow. "Spare me the preamble," Ethan snapped. "Just tell me the truth." Robert let out a heavy sigh, his gaze fixed on the box of evidence on the table. "Lila and we started seeing each other not long after Daniel and I began working together. She was lonely and I was weak. Your mother and I were going through a rough patch, and I let myself fall into something I knew was wrong." Ethan's stomach twisted at the words, the image of his father as a pillar of strength and integrity crumbling before his eyes. "It was just supposed to be an affair," Robert continued. "A mistake we'd both move on from. But Lila, she wanted more. She wanted me to leave your mother, to start a new life with her. I told her it wasn't possible, that I couldn't destroy our family like that." "So what?" Ethan spat. "You just kept sneaking around behind everyone's back?" "For a while, yes," Robert admitted. "But then Daniel found out. He confronted me at the construction site late one night. He was furious, said he was going to tell Lila to leave me and that he'd ruin my career if I didn't end things." Ethan's chest tightened. "And that's when the fire happened." Robert nodded, his expression haunted. "Daniel was out of control. He started throwing things, shouting. I tried to calm him down, but he grabbed a blowtorch we'd been using earlier in the day. Said if I wanted to burn my family to the ground, he'd help me do it." Ethan stared at him, the room spinning. "So, what did you do?" Robert's voice dropped to a whisper. "We fought. I tried to get the torch away from him, but it fell. Sparks hit a pile of wood shavings, and the fire spread so fast, I couldn't stop it. Daniel, he was trapped. I tried to save him, but it was too late." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "You're saying it was an accident?" "Yes," Robert said, his voice pleading. "I swear to you, Ethan, I didn't mean for him to die. But when the fire was ruled an accident, I didn't correct them. I thought it was better that way. For everyone." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Better for everyone? You've been living a lie for years, and now Madison is tangled up in it, too." Robert's expression darkened. "Madison didn't know anything about Daniel. I only brought her in recently, when someone started leaving notes on my car, threatening to expose me." "Threats?" Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. Robert nodded. "Whoever it is, they know about Lila. About the fire. They want money to keep quiet. That's why I had Madison meet me at the house, to help me figure out what to do." Ethan's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The secret meetings, the nervous glances, the lies. It wasn't just guilt that had been driving Robert and Madison, it was fear. "And you never thought to tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking with anger. "You didn't think I had a right to know?" Robert hung his head. "I didn't want to drag you into it. I was trying to protect you." Ethan slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. "Protect me? You don't get to pretend you're some kind of hero. You lied to me, to Mom, to everyone. And now you're expecting me to what? Forgive you? I don't expect anything," Robert said quietly. "I just wanted you to know the truth." Ethan stormed out of the house, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. He drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of everything he had learned. His father wasn't just a liar, he was a coward, someone who had let his mistakes fester until they became poison. And Madison, her role in all of this was more complicated. She had lied, yes, but she had also been manipulated, drawn into a nightmare that wasn't entirely hers to bear. When Ethan finally returned home, Madison was waiting for him in the living room. She stood as he entered, her eyes red from crying. "You went to see him," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer, just dropped the box of evidence onto the coffee table. "I know everything," he said. Madison's hands trembled as she approached him. Ethan, You lied to me, he interrupted, his voice cold. You lied to my face day after day, while you helped him cover up the worst thing he's ever done. I was trying to protect you, Madison said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want you to get hurt. Ethan laughed bitterly. Protect me? Do you even hear yourself? All you've done is hurt me, Madison. You and my father, both of you. Madison reached out to him, but he stepped back, his heart aching as he saw the pain in her eyes. Ethan, please. I love you. I didn't know how to handle this. I thought I was doing the right thing. Ethan shook his head, his voice breaking. The right thing would have been to tell me the truth. From the start. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with the weight of their shattered trust. Finally, Madison whispered, What are you going to do? Ethan looked at her, his jaw tightening. I don't know yet. But I'm not letting this stay buried. Not anymore. Madison's eyes widened with fear. Ethan, if you go public with this, then let the chips fall where they may, Ethan said, cutting her off. This family has been living with lies for too long. It's time for the truth. Ethan spent the next several hours combing through the evidence again, piecing together the story in full. The letters, the journals, the photos, they all painted a damning picture of Robert's affair and its deadly consequences. But one thing still didn't make sense, the threats. Who was sending them? As Ethan stared at the notes Madison had retrieved from Robert, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the threats weren't coming from someone outside the family? What if the real danger was closer than he realized? Ethan spent the night turning everything over in his mind, staring at the scattered evidence on the coffee table as though it might rearrange itself into something clearer. His father's affair with Lila, the fire, Daniel's death, it was all connected. And yet, one glaring mystery remained, the threats. Who knew the truth? And why were they coming forward now? The thought that it might be someone in the family sent a shiver down his spine. Was it possible his sister Carly had uncovered the secret, and was using it to force Robert's hand? Or was there someone else, someone even closer? By morning, Ethan had made his decision. He wasn't going to wait for the truth to come to him, he was going to force it into the light. That afternoon, Ethan gathered Madison, Robert, and Carly at his home. The tension in the room was palpable as they sat in the living room, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Madison wouldn't meet his eyes, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Robert looked weary, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Carly, on the other hand, seemed genuinely baffled by the sudden meeting. What's going on? Carly asked, breaking the silence. Why are we all here? Ethan stood at the center of the room, his gaze sharp as he looked at each of them in turn. We're here because this family has been living with lies for far too long. And it's time for the truth to come out. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Ethan, we don't need to. Yes, we do, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. Because I know everything, Dad. I know about you and Lila. I know about Daniel. And I know about the fire. Carly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What? What fire? Robert paled, his composure slipping. Ethan, please. No, Ethan said, his tone cutting. No more lies. You owe all of us the truth. Robert looked down at his hands, his shoulders sagging. I already told you everything. I didn't mean for Daniel to die. It was an accident. And the threats? Ethan pressed. Who's been sending them? Robert's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know. I thought maybe it was someone who worked with us back then, someone who heard rumors. Ethan shook his head. It's not just some random person. Whoever it is knows too much. And I think they're closer than we realize. He turned to Madison, his gaze piercing. Do you know who it is? Madison shook her head vehemently, tears brimming in her eyes. No, Ethan. I swear I don't know. Ethan's stomach churned as he looked at Carly, whose face was pale with shock. Carly? He asked. Is it you? Carly's eyes widened. Me? Are you serious? I didn't even know about any of this until 2 minutes ago. Ethan studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. But her confusion seemed genuine. And then, like a thunderclap, the realization hit him. No, he murmured, his blood running cold. It's not any of you. He turned back to the coffee table, where the notes were spread out. Picking one up, he stared at the handwriting, his mind racing. It was familiar, but not because he had seen it in these notes. He had seen it elsewhere. His hands trembled as he reached into the box of evidence, pulling out Lila's letters. Holding one of the notes next to a letter, he compared the handwriting. It was a perfect match. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Robert, his voice trembling. It's Lila. Robert froze, his face going pale. That's impossible. Lila's dead. Ethan shook his head, the pieces falling into place. No, she's not. She faked her death, didn't she? After the fire, she disappeared. But she didn't die. Robert's eyes darted around the room, his panic evident. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me! Ethan shouted, slamming his fist on the table. You knew, didn't you? You knew she was alive, and you've been helping her stay hidden. Robert looked like he was about to speak, but then a voice from the doorway cut through the tension like a knife. He's right. Everyone turned, their jaws dropping as a woman stepped into the room. She was older now, her once dark hair streaked with gray, but there was no mistaking her. It was Lila. The room erupted into chaos. Carly gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Madison stared in shock, her mouth agape. Robert looked like he had seen a ghost. Lila, he whispered, his voice trembling. What are you doing here? I had to come, Lila said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. I couldn't keep hiding anymore. Not when everything was falling apart. Ethan stepped forward, his anger boiling over. You've been sending the threats, haven't you? Why? Why now? Lila met his gaze, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of guilt and defiance. Because I wanted justice. For Daniel. For everything Robert took from me. Robert stood, his expression a mix of shock and fury. Justice? You're the one who dragged me into this mess. You're the one who wouldn't let go. You killed my husband. Lila shot back, her voice rising. You left me with nothing. The words hung in the air, the weight of them crushing. Ethan stared at his father, his world crumbling around him. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you kill him? Robert's face twisted with anguish. It was an accident, Ethan. I swear to you, it was an accident. But Ethan didn't believe him anymore. He turned to Lila, his mind racing. Why come back now? Why threaten him after all these years? Lila's eyes softened as she looked at him. Because I wanted him to pay. I wanted him to feel what it's like to lose everything. And what about me? Ethan asked, his voice breaking. Did you think about what this would do to me? To my family? Lila's face fell, guilt flashing across her features. I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan. But you deserve to know the truth. Ethan shook his head, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. The truth? The truth has destroyed everything. In the end, Ethan made the decision to turn everything over to the authorities. The letters, the journals, the threats. Lila disappeared again, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. Robert was arrested and charged with manslaughter for Daniel's death, his secrets, finally exposed. As for Madison, their marriage was left in tatters. Though she begged for forgiveness, Ethan couldn't look at her the same way. The trust they had shared was gone, replaced by a chasm too wide to bridge. Ethan sold the house and moved away with his kids, determined to rebuild his life from the ashes of the truth. But no matter how far he went, the scars of betrayal lingered, a reminder of the tangled lies that had destroyed his family. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still, he couldn't help but wonder, if he had never overheard that conversation at the barbecue, would the truth have remained buried forever? Some secrets, he realized, were meant to destroy.